in the sprawling mess of stars that civilized beings generously called the Galactic Federation, there existed a simple truth that even the most pacifist philosophers couldn't argue with. Sometimes, you needed someone found, and sometimes, you needed them found the hard way. This cosmic fact of life had given birth to an entire profession of individuals who specialized in making the unwilling willing to come along quietly, or not so quietly, depending on the day's mood and the bounty's attitude. At the apex of this professionally violent pyramid sat a creature whose very name made hardened criminals reconsider their life choices. She stood nearly 8 feet tall when she bothered to stand straight, which wasn't often since intimidation worked better with a predatory slouch. Her exoskeleton gleamed with a metallic sheen that shifted between deep purple and black depending on the light, and her forearms moved with the kind of fluid precision that suggested she could thread a needle or snap a neck with equal ease. 6 compound eyes arranged in a perfect hexagon around her elongated skull tracked movement with the dedication of a tax auditor and twice the malice. The Hunters Guild had stopped keeping official records of her success rate after it became mathematically embarrassing to everyone else. Whispered conversations in cantina corners spoke of captures so legendary they'd become bedtime stories. Parents told their children cautionary tales about what happened when you thought you were clever enough to outrun the consequences of your action. She had dragged Vortanian crime lords out of their supposedly impregnable fortress worlds, plucked Andromedan pirates from the middle of their own fleets, and once famously extracted a Regillian tax evader from inside a black hole's event horizon, though the physics department was still arguing about how that last one was theoretically possible. Her methods were as varied as they were effective. She'd been known to spend months learning the cultural nuances of her target's homeworld, mastering local customs until she could blend in seamlessly before striking. Other times she simply walked through the front door and asked politely if her quarry would mind coming along, a request that carried considerably more weight when delivered by someone whose casual stance suggested she could dismantle the building if the conversation went poorly. What made her truly dangerous wasn't just her physical capabilities, though those were considerable, but her absolute dedication to understanding her prey. She studied behavioral patterns like a xenopsychologist, analyzed escape routes like a military strategist, and prepared for contingencies like someone who'd learned the hard way that overconfidence was just failure taking the scenic route. Every hunt was a masterpiece of preparation, execution, and inevitable conclusion, which made her current assignment somewhat puzzling. The bounty request had come through the usual channels, encrypted with military-grade security protocols, and bearing the kind of credit authorization that made even veteran hunters pause to count the zeros twice. Standard extraction job: locate, acquire, deliver. The target was described in the tersest possible terms: human female, mid-20s, brown hair, approximately average height and build for her species. Location: the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star system on the outer rim, locally designated as Earth. She'd stared at the assignment parameters for several minutes, waiting for the additional files to load. Surely there had to be more. Special combat training, perhaps. Cybernetic enhancement. A history of military service or criminal expertise that would justify the astronomical bounty being offered. Something that would explain why anyone would pay this much for what appeared to be a routine pickup of an entirely ordinary human female. But the files remained stubbornly brief. No criminal record, no military background, no apparent skills beyond what the databases dismissively categorized as standard human baseline capability. The target worked in something called customer service, a profession that meant absolutely nothing to someone whose job description involved significantly more straightforward problem-solving methods. Humans were by all accounts laughably fragile creatures. They'd only recently figured out faster-than-light travel, still used primitive chemical propulsion for most of their spaceflight, and had managed to nearly extinct themselves at least twice in their recorded history through what could only be described as aggressive stupidity. Their military forces were considered adequate for dealing with space pirates and the occasional territorial dispute, but hardly impressive by galactic standards. They had no natural armor, no enhanced strength, no telepathic abilities, and their reaction times were mediocre at best. In other words, they were exactly the sort of species that made bounty hunting feel less like a profession and more like a particularly well-paid hobby. She accepted the contract with something approaching boredom. After decades of tracking the galaxy's most dangerous fugitives through hostile environments and against impossible odds, the prospect of collecting an ordinary human from a backwater planet felt almost insulting. Still, the credits were real, and even legendary hunters had bills to pay. The journey to Earth took 3 standard days, most of which she spent reviewing what little intelligence was available about human behavior and psychology. The databases painted a picture of a species that relied heavily on social cooperation and tool use to compensate for their obvious physical limitation. They were apparently quite good at problem solving within groups, but individually fragile and prone to panic when isolated from their social structures. Perfect, in other words, for a quick and efficient extraction. Her ship dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system, invisible to the primitive detection arrays that Earth's inhabitants still relied on for monitoring their immediate stellar neighborhood. A few hours of careful observation confirmed that the planet's defenses were exactly as unimpressive as the intelligence reports had suggested. A handful of orbital platforms that could probably handle pirates, maybe, if the pirates were having a particularly bad day and had forgotten to maintain their weapons system. She plotted a course for the planet's surface, selected an insertion point that would place her within walking distance of the target's last known location, and began the final approach with the kind of casual confidence that came from knowing this job would be over before long. After all, how dangerous could one human woman possibly be? The atmospheric entry went exactly as planned, which should have been the first warning sign for someone whose career had been built on the principle that when things went according to plan, the universe was probably setting up a particularly elaborate practical joke. Her ship's stealth systems rendered it invisible to both electronic detection and visual observation as it descended through Earth's unremarkably standard atmosphere, touching down in what the locals called a national forest, apparently a quaint custom where they set aside large areas of wilderness and then spent considerable effort preventing anyone from doing anything useful with them. The target's location had been narrowed down to a metropolitan area the humans had optimistically named Chicago, a sprawling collection of vertical structures and transportation arteries that demonstrated their species' peculiar talent for creating maximum inconvenience through urban planning. According to the most recent intelligence, the subject maintained a residence in one of the countless identical dwelling units that humans seem to prefer, worked at a facility dedicated to something called customer service, and followed a routine so predictable it might as well have been choreographed specifically for the convenience of professional hunters. She activated her personal cloaking field and began the trek toward the city, her forearms moving in perfect synchronization as she navigated the surprisingly dense forest. The local flora was aggressively ordinary, green photosynthetic organisms that seemed to exist primarily to inconvenience anyone trying to move through them quickly. The fauna appeared to consist mainly of small mammals whose primary survival strategy involved making unnecessarily loud noises and then running away, a behavioral pattern that struck her as remarkably similar to what she expected from her target. The urban perimeter proved equally unimpressive. Humans had apparently never learned the basic principle of defensive architecture, constructing their cities with multiple entry points and virtually no serious barriers against intrusion. Their security systems relied heavily on primitive electronic surveillance and the sort of physical barriers that wouldn't slow down a determined child, let alone someone with professional training and advanced equipment. Finding the target's residence required less than an hour of careful observation and database cross-referencing. The building stood among dozens of identical structures, each one a monument to humanity's apparent belief that conformity was somehow preferable to individuality. The target's specific unit was located on the 3rd floor, accessible through a stairwell that had been designed with all the security considerations of a public thoroughfare. She positioned herself across the street and settled in to observe, activating her suit's long-range sensors to monitor the target's activity. This was the part of the job that separated professionals from amateurs, the patient accumulation of behavioral data that would make the actual capture a foregone conclusion. Every species had patterns, routines, predictable responses to stress and danger. Humans were no exception. The target emerged right on schedule, confirming the intelligence reports about her predictable routine: average height, brown hair, unremarkable in every way that mattered for identification purposes. She moved with the kind of casual confidence that humans seemed to mistake for awareness, completely oblivious to the fact that she was being observed by someone whose ocular implants could track her movement from 3 city blocks away. The morning routine was exactly what the psychological profiles had predicted. The target stopped at a commercial establishment that served stimulant beverages, engaged in brief social interaction with the service personnel, and then proceeded to her place of employment, a gleaming office tower that housed dozens of businesses and apparently thousands of humans who spent their days doing whatever it was that humans considered productive work. Isolated from her social support structure, following a predictable pattern, completely unaware that her life was about to become significantly more complicated. The extraction would be simple: wait for her to leave the building, follow her to a location with minimal witnesses, deploy a localized stun field and transport her back to the ship. 3 hours, maybe 4 if she wanted to be particularly careful about avoiding the local authority. She spent the day cataloging the target's routine, noting exit times, preferred routes, potential complications. The human moved through her environment with the sort of oblivious confidence that suggested she'd never had to consider the possibility that someone might be watching her with professional interest. She stopped at the same commercial establishments, interacted with the same individuals, followed the same pathways with mechanical precision. When evening arrived, the target emerged from her workplace and began the journey back to her residence, following a route that would take her through several areas with minimal pedestrian traffic, ideal for someone who preferred to conduct business without unnecessary witnesses or complications. The hunter followed at a discreet distance, her cloaking field rendering her invisible to both human senses and their primitive surveillance system. The target walked with purpose but without apparent awareness, occasionally pausing to interact with her personal communication device or to examine the contents of retail establishments. Standard human behavior, exactly as predicted by the psychological profile. 3 blocks from the target's residence, she made her move. The stun field deployed exactly as designed, creating a localized distortion in the electromagnetic spectrum that should have rendered the target unconscious within seconds. Humans had no natural resistance to this particular form of incapacitation. Their neural systems simply weren't equipped to handle the kind of targeted interference that made professional extraction work possible, except the target didn't collapse. Instead, she stumbled slightly, shook her head as if clearing away confusion, and then did something that sent the first genuine spike of concern through the hunter's consciousness in longer than she cared to remember. The human looked directly at her, through the cloaking field, through the electromagnetic distortion, through every piece of advanced technology that was supposed to make detection impossible, and well, the target said, her voice carrying the kind of casual amusement that suggested this was exactly what she'd been expecting. That's certainly an interesting way to introduce yourself. Though I have to say, your technique could use some work. The hunter's compound eyes refocused rapidly, running threat assessment protocols that hadn't been activated in years. This wasn't standard human behavior. This wasn't standard behavior for any species she'd encountered. Humans weren't supposed to be resistant to neural incapacitation. They weren't supposed to be able to see through military-grade cloaking technology. They certainly weren't supposed to react to attempted capture with what appeared to be genuine amusement. You seem surprised, the target continued, taking a step closer. Did your research not cover human adaptability? Because that seems like quite an oversight for someone in your profession. The hunter's forearms moved to combat positions automatically, muscle memory overriding the growing sense that this situation had deviated so far from the expected parameters that her standard operating procedures might need some serious revision. She'd handled resistance before, of course. Most targets didn't go quietly, and she'd developed techniques for dealing with every form of opposition the galaxy's criminal population could devise. But those techniques assumed that her targets were operating within the normal boundaries of their species' capability. They assumed that her equipment would function as designed. They assumed that the element of surprise would provide the crucial advantage that made extraction possible without unnecessary complication. The human took another step forward, and for the first time in her professional career, the galaxy's most feared bounty hunter found herself taking a step back. "Oh, don't worry," the target said, her tone shifting to something that sounded almost reassuring. "I'm not going to hurt you. At least, not unless you insist on making this more difficult than it needs to be. I was actually hoping we could have a conversation first." Professional to professional. The words hung in the air like a challenge.
carrying implications that the hunter's tactical analysis subroutines were frantically trying to process. How did an ordinary human female know enough about bounty hunting protocols to reference professional courtesy? How had she detected the stun field deployment? How was she continuing to track movement through a cloaking system that bent light around its user? And why, despite every instinct screaming that this situation required immediate tactical withdrawal, did the hunter find herself genuinely curious about what this impossibly calm human had to say?
The conversation that followed was unlike anything in the hunter's extensive professional experience, primarily because it wasn't really a conversation at all. It was more like a polite lecture delivered by someone who'd done entirely too much homework and was now eager to share the results with the class. The human walked casually down the street, maintaining a pace that suggested she had all the time in the world, while explaining in cheerfully matter-of-fact tones exactly how she'd detected the stun field, identified the cloaking technology, and tracked the hunter's movements for the better part of 3 days. "Your electromagnetic signature is actually quite distinctive," she said, pausing to examine the contents of a shop window with apparent genuine interest. "Most species develop stealth technology based on their own sensory limitations, which makes perfect sense from an evolutionary perspective. But humans have this interesting quirk where we supplement our natural senses with technology, and then supplement that technology with more technology, until we're detecting things that we're not even consciously aware we're detecting." The hunter's tactical systems were running continuous threat assessments, each one returning results that made less sense than the last. The human displayed no obvious weapons, no visible combat enhancements, no signs of the kind of military training that would explain her apparent immunity to standard extraction protocol. She moved like someone taking an evening stroll, not like someone evading capture by one of the galaxy's most feared professionals. "You've been following my routine for weeks, haven't you?" The human continued, turning down a side street that led away from the main thoroughfare. "I have to admit, your patience is impressive. Most people would have made their move after a few days of observation, but you took the time to really study the pattern, understand the environment, plan for contingencies. Very professional." The hunter followed, because at this point the alternative was admitting that she'd lost control of the situation entirely, and her pride had limits even when faced with the impossible. The side street led into a more industrial area, with fewer pedestrians and more shadows, exactly the sort of terrain that favored someone with advanced equipment and extensive combat training. Exactly the sort of terrain where a professional extraction could be completed without witnesses or complication. Exactly, Liz realized with growing unease, the sort of terrain that someone familiar with professional extraction techniques would choose if they wanted to lure a hunter into a more controlled environment. "The thing about humans," the target continued, her tone remaining conversational despite the fact that they were now moving through an area where the ambient lighting provided excellent concealment opportunities, "is that we're really quite good at pattern recognition once we know we need to look for patterns, and you've been very thorough in establishing my routine. Very predictable in your observation methods, very consistent in your approach to surveillance." She stopped walking and turned to face the hunter directly, her expression shifting from casual amusement to something that looked almost apologetic. "Which means that for the past week I've been establishing your routine." The implications of that statement were still processing through the hunter's tactical analysis systems when the first trap activated. The electromagnetic pulse erupted from concealed emitters positioned throughout the alley, designed with the specific frequency characteristics necessary to overload the hunter's suit system. Her cloaking field collapsed first, followed by her enhanced sensory array, then her targeting systems and communication network. In the span of 3 seconds, she went from being an invisible predator equipped with technology centuries ahead of anything the locals could deploy, to being a very large, very visible alien standing in the middle of what was obviously a carefully prepared kill zone. The human watched this process with the sort of professional interest that suggested she'd put considerable thought into the technical requirements. "I hope you don't mind the electromagnetic pulse," she said. "I know how much you rely on your equipment, but I really needed to level the playing field a bit. Your technology is impressive, but it does have some interesting vulnerabilities once you understand the underlying principle." The hunter's forearms moved toward her weapons harnesses, only to discover that the EMP had also disabled the electromagnetic locks on her equipment pouches. Her backup systems were offline. Her emergency protocols weren't responding. Even her basic suit functions were operating at minimal capacity, leaving her with nothing but her natural capabilities and whatever improvisational skills she could muster. Now, before you try anything dramatic, the human continued, producing what appeared to be a standard human communication device. I should mention that this entire area is being monitored by a rather sophisticated sensor network. Not human technology, obviously. I borrowed some techniques from a very helpful Andromedan engineer I met last year. Lovely woman, very eager to discuss the theoretical applications of alien countermeasures once she understood that I was genuinely interested in the academic aspect. The hunter's compound eyes tracked the movement of the device, noting the way the human held it with casual familiarity. Not like someone who'd recently acquired unfamiliar technology, but like someone who'd spent considerable time learning its capabilities and limitations. The interesting thing about bounty hunters, the human said, beginning to walk again, this time toward what appeared to be a loading dock behind one of the industrial buildings, is that you're all so focused on your targets that you rarely consider whether your targets might be focused on you. It's a natural professional blind spot, really. When you're accustomed to being the apex predator, you don't spend much time worrying about whether something might be hunting you back. The loading dock area was darker than the alley, with multiple levels and numerous potential concealment positions. The hunter's threat assessment protocols were screaming warnings about tactical disadvantage, enemy preparation, and the urgent need for immediate extraction from what was clearly a compromised situation. But her extraction protocols required functional equipment, and her equipment was currently operating at about 15% of normal capacity. I've been studying your methods for quite some time now, the human continued, settling herself on the edge of a loading platform with the casual air of someone beginning a lengthy explanation. Your approach to different species, your adaptation to various environments, your contingency planning, really quite impressive work. I particularly enjoyed your extraction of that Vortanian crime lord, the way you spent 6 months learning their cultural protocols just to get close enough for a clean capture. That showed real dedication to the craft. The hunter's mind raced through the implication. This human knew details about operations that weren't part of any public record, information that was classified at the highest levels of the Hunters Guild, intelligence that should have been accessible only to guild leadership and the specific operatives involved in each case. Of course, studying your methods meant understanding your equipment, your typical approaches, your preferred extraction protocols. The human's smile widened slightly, and once I understood those things, developing countermeasures became more of an engineering problem than anything else. A soft chiming sound from the human's device indicated incoming data, and she glanced at it with satisfaction. Excellent. That confirms your ship's location. I have to say, your stealth technology is quite good, but once you know what to look for, those gravitational anomalies are fairly distinctive. The hunter felt something that she hadn't experienced in decades of professional hunting, the cold certainty that she was no longer in control of the situation. The human hadn't just resisted capture, she'd systematically dismantled every advantage that made professional extraction possible. She'd turned the hunter's own methods against her, used her predictability as a weapon, and done it all with the sort of casual competence that suggested this wasn't luck or accident. This was preparation. This was plan. This was someone who'd approached the problem of being hunted by a galactic-level professional with the same methodical thoroughness that the hunter herself brought to her work. Now then, the human said, standing up and brushing imaginary dust from her clothing, I believe it's time we discussed why someone placed such an unusually large bounty on such an apparently ordinary human female, because I have a feeling that's where this story gets really interesting. The hunter's compound eyes focused with predatory intensity, waiting for the revelation that would explain how an ordinary customer service representative had managed to accomplish what the galaxy's most dangerous criminals had failed to do for decades. The explanation, when it came, was delivered with the same casual tone the human had used for everything else, as if dismantling legendary bounty hunters was just another item on her daily agenda. My name is Adelaide Chen, she began, settling back onto the loading platform with the air of someone beginning a story she'd been looking forward to telling. And until recently, I was the head of xenological warfare research for Earth's Strategic Defense Initiative. Customer service was my cover identity, which I have to say worked remarkably well. Most people assumed that anyone working in customer service
couldn't possibly be qualified to do anything requiring actual intelligence. The hunter's tactical analysis, subroutines finally began producing results that made some semblance of sense. Xenological warfare research that explained the familiarity with alien technology, the understanding of different species' capabilities, the casual competence in dealing with off-world threats. But it raised an even more disturbing question. If this human was a military researcher, why had someone put a bounty on her head? The thing about studying how to fight alien species, Chen continued, is that you have to understand how they think, how they operate, what their strengths and weaknesses are. You spend years learning about their technology, their tactics, their psychology. You become expert in predicting their behavior patterns and developing countermeasures for their capabilities. She gestured toward the hunter's disabled equipment with casual precision. Your species, for example, relies heavily on technological superiority and individual You're apex predators by nature, which makes you incredibly effective against prey that behaves like prey. But you have a significant blind spot when it comes to dealing with pack hunters, who've learned to coordinate their efforts. The implication hit the hunter like a physical blow. Pack hunters. Coordination. This hadn't been a solo operation by a single human female. This had been a team effort by a species that specialized in collaborative problem solving. Oh yes, Chen said, apparently reading the realization in the hunter's body language. There are others. Quite a few others, actually. Turns out that when humans put their minds to the problem of dealing with galactic-level threats, we can be remarkably creative. We've been studying your methods, your technology, your psychological profiles for months, learning everything we could about how the galaxy's professional hunters operate. Chen's communication device chimed again, and she glanced at it with satisfaction. That would be confirmation that your ship's systems have been quietly infiltrated and disabled. Nothing permanent, you understand, but enough to prevent any unfortunate misunderstandings about who's in control of this situation. The hunter felt her exoskeleton plates shifting involuntarily, a stress response she hadn't experienced since her early days as an apprentice hunter. Her ship was her lifeline, her escape route, her mobile base of operations. Without it, she was stranded on a primitive world, with no backup, no extraction protocol, and no way to call for assistance. The bounty on my head, Chin continued, was placed by a consortium of galactic criminal organizations, who've grown rather tired of human interference in their operations. Apparently, our research into xenological countermeasures has been making their lives considerably more difficult. They thought that removing me would solve their problem. She smiled, and for the first time, the expression carried something that looked genuinely dangerous. They were wrong about that. Removing me would just activate contingency protocols that would distribute everything I've learned to every human military organization, intelligence agency, and research institution on Earth. My death would make their problems significantly worse, not better. The hunter's mind raced through the tactical implications. If this human was telling the truth, then the bounty wasn't just a routine extraction job. It was an assassination contract disguised as a capture mission, and she'd been selected not because of her skill at bringing back living targets, but because of her reputation for reliability when targets needed to disappear permanently. You weren't hired to capture me, Chin said, confirming the hunter's worst suspicion. You were hired to kill me and make it look like an accident. A regrettable outcome during a routine extraction, perhaps. The kind of thing that happens sometimes when targets resist capture. The hunter's forearms moved instinctively toward weapons that were no longer functional, a gesture that Chin observed with professional interest. The ironic thing, Chin continued, is that by sending the galaxy's most feared bounty hunter to eliminate me, they've actually given me the perfect opportunity to field test our countermeasures against the highest possible level of threat. You've been invaluable as a test subject, really. I couldn't have asked for better validation of our theoretical models. Test subject. The words carried implications that made the hunter's compound eyes refocus sharply. She hadn't been outwitted by superior preparation or caught off guard by unexpected resistance. She'd been deliberately lured into a controlled experiment, designed to evaluate human capabilities against galactic-level threat. The beautiful thing about humans, Chin said, standing up and beginning to pace with the casual energy of someone enjoying a successful presentation, is that we don't have to be individually superior to be collectively effective. We're pack hunters by evolution, social problem solvers by instinct. When we identify a threat, we don't just develop individual responses, we develop systematic solutions that can be replicated and improved by others. She gestured toward the disabled hunter with something that looked like genuine appreciation. You've helped us prove that even the galaxy's apex predators have vulnerabilities that can be exploited by a species that approaches the problem from a collaborative perspective. Your methods, your technology, your psychological profiles, all of it can be studied, understood, and countered by a species that specializes in turning individual excellence into collective advantage. The hunter realized with growing horror that this hadn't been a hunt at all. It had been a recruitment opportunity. Chen hadn't just captured her. She demonstrated human capabilities to someone whose professional reputation would carry considerable weight with the galactic criminal community. Word of this encounter would spread through the underground networks, carrying a message that would make every potential threat to humanity reconsider their assessment of this primitive species. Of course, Chen said, checking her communication device one more time. This does leave us with the question of what to do with you. You came here to kill me on behalf of organizations that consider humanity a minor annoyance to be eliminated. But you're also a professional who was operating under false pretenses, which suggests you might be open to alternative arrangements. She looked directly at the hunter, her expression shifting to something that looked like a business proposition. I'm prepared to offer you a choice. You can return to your employers and explain that the mission was unsuccessful due to circumstances beyond your control. Or you can stay here and help us understand exactly how the galactic bounty hunting community operates, in exchange for some very interesting insights into human countermeasure development. The hunter's pride warred with her survival instincts and her growing professional curiosity. She'd spent decades believing that individual excellence was the ultimate measure of capability, only to discover that there were species who turned collaborative mediocrity into something that could neutralize individual superiority. It was intellectually fascinating and personally terrifying in equal measure. Think about it, Chin said, beginning to walk toward the exit of the loading dock area. You've spent your entire career being the most dangerous predator in whatever environment you enter. But humans aren't prey, and we're not individual competitors. We're something else entirely. Something that turns the entire predator-prey dynamic into an irrelevant concept. She paused at the edge of the dock and looked back at the hunter one final time. The galaxy's criminals made a serious mistake when they decided humanity was a problem that could be solved by eliminating individuals. They sent the perfect hunter to kill an ordinary human woman, never realizing that there's no such thing as an ordinary human when we're working together. As Chen disappeared into the shadows, leaving the hunter alone with her disabled equipment and shattered assumptions about the natural order of galactic predation, one thought echoed through her consciousness with the persistence of a tactical alert that refused to be silenced. She'd finally encountered prey that hunted back, and it was absolutely terrifying how good they were at it. The galaxy's most feared bounty hunter sat in the darkness of an Earth loading dock, contemplating the uncomfortable realization that she might have just discovered her own species' first natural predator. And somehow, despite everything, she found herself looking forward to learning more about how they did it.